Today in the Science Communicator, we're going to talk about this book, The Man from the Future, The Visionary Life of John von Neumann. And before we move on to the conversation, I would like to say there are, in my opinion, two really good reasons why it's absolutely worth reading this excellent book. Reason number two is, of course, John von Neumann, a Hungarian-born outstanding mathematician, physicist, computer scientist, whose amazing life and scientific career are the subject of the book. And reason number two is the engaging, gripping style in which the book was written by its author, who is sitting right next to me in a way at the moment, Ananyo Bhattacharya, who is now, correct me if I'm wrong, the chief science writer at the London Institute for Mathematical Science, but you used to be, among the others, a science correspondent at The Economist. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you very much, Beata. Yeah, that's right. I'm chief science writer at the London Institute for Mathematical Sciences right now. Before that, I was, of course, writing the book, and I had a few years of freelancing. And prior to that, I was at The Economist, and before that, I was at Nature. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. In our conversation, we're not going to summarize the book, of course, because we would like our listeners to actually read the book. But we can talk about selected aspects of John von Neumann's career and accomplishments. And to begin with, I would like to ask you, who was John von Neumann, in a few words, by way of introduction, and why did you decide to write a book about him?
Yeah, as you so sort of eloquently summarized earlier on, von Neumann had these contributions to wildly different areas of science, of politics, but strangely, he's largely been forgotten, at least by the general public. I think there's a few scientists that know the name if they happen to overlap with one of his many areas of interest. So for me, von Neumann was the one person who, perhaps more than any other, is accountable for kicking open the doors of the 21st century. And why would I say that? So he was born in Budapest at the turn of the century. He was a Jewish Hungarian, and his father was a wealthy banker. He was a self-made man. He was brought up with many of the luxuries that you would expect, a brilliant education, and so on. But it was quite clear from an early age that there was something very different about him. He had two brothers, and his genius just stood out from a very, very young age. And his genius was in the realm of mathematics. And as a result, by the time he was a teenager, he was already publishing serious journal papers. His talent was such that his father, who was initially opposed to his boy pursuing mathematics because he thought it didn't make money, he went out and ensured that von Neumann would get exposure to high-level maths. So professors at the university, at Budapest University, took him under his wing, and one of their first encounters with him was so moving that when the professor went home to talk about this remarkable individual to his wife, he began to cry. So that was the level of genius. And then later in 1930, he moved to Princeton and eventually became an American naturalized citizen. And it was really in his 20s, 30s, and even 40s, right up until his deathbed, where he made these amazing contributions to different fields that that we are just beginning really to understand today.
Yes, John von Neumann was first and foremost a mathematician, and his contributions to mathematics are actually countless. It would be impossible to talk about them in a few conversations, and not let alone one conversation. But which do you think is or are particularly important? I know he wrote 2 major papers in mathematics already at the age of 18 or 19, right?
Yeah. So this is difficult. So we're talking about pure mathematics, of course, because all of von Neumann's contributions were in essence mathematical, I suppose, or many of them were. But in pure mathematics, I suppose some of the most important things was that early on, he got involved with the foundations of mathematics. And this was an extremely, I suppose, fashionable problem at the time. So what happened was that there were paradoxes creeping in to set theory, which is the sort of language of mathematics, even down to today. And these paradoxes took the form of kind of the liar's paradox, for example, which is that this statement is a lie. Now, if that's true, it's false, and if it's false, it's true. And there were very similar things creeping in to mathematical logic, and that meant that the foundations of mathematics were very much under assault. And David Hilbert, who was a great German mathematician and kind of really the standard bearer of mathematics in his day, said, look, we have to get these fixed. And lots of mathematicians tried, and Bertrand Russell, for example, was among them. He found these paradoxes, and von Neumann engaged with this. And really, his engagement with logic at such a young age would influence his thinking for the rest of his life. This is how he approached problems. He would take a problem, whether it was, how do we talk about human behavior in mathematical terms? And he would turn that into a problem of logic. He would come up with a model. And then his brain was such that he could take any problem, really, when expressed in logical terms, and just bulldoze his way through it, even problems that others thought were impossible. So one of the things he did was that there was a problem with the counting numbers. So 1, 2, 3, 4, right? And the definition of the counting numbers was very uncertain because of these paradoxes that we were talking about. And one of the first things that von Neumann did, I think, when he was 19, was put these counting numbers on firm foundations, really, for the first time. And it's his proof that people tend to use now, mathematicians will tend to use when they talk about these counting numbers. And so that was a remarkable accomplishment. And as a result of his interest in logic, he also was very familiar with the work of Gödel and Alan Turing, which later on would form his thinking around computing and computer programs in particular. So that's just one area where he contributed. A second area would be what we now call von Neumann algebras. Now, I think I devote all of maybe 3 sentences to von Neumann algebras in the book because I don't get into his pure mathematics at all. But von Neumann algebras were, he published in total dozens of papers on these, and they filled up books. And even so, he just sort of scraped the surface of what was achievable. And then decades later, and even now, it turns out that these algebras are making a resurgence in both mathematics and theoretical physics. So just one example is that Alain Connes and Carlo Rovelli in their work, they suggest that why does time flow in one direction? And this turns out to be a really difficult problem. And they suggest that one kind of von Neumann algebras lie at the heart of this. So they've become tremendously important again. So, yeah.
Yeah, you mentioned computing, logic computing. Of course, again, I need to repeat the word contribution, huge contributions by John von Neumann to modern computer science. A lot of our listeners, I'm sure, are interested in information technology and computer science. So in what way what did John von Neumann do for the development of computing? And in this context, a very interesting element of the story that you include in your book is the influence, the sort of participation in this process of Klari, the second wife of von Neumann.
Yeah, absolutely. So it may surprise your listeners to learn that it was actually John von Neumann who's largely responsible for the dawn of the computer age, because we associate lots of other names with that. For example, Alan Turing. Yeah. But in fact, Alan Turing's contribution was a mathematical paper describing what's become known as the Turing machine. But it was a work of pure mathematical logic. It had very little to do with the devices that we use today. And in fact, Alan Turing's paper was only very much later then absorbed into this new discipline called computer science and regarded as a sort of theoretical underpinning of the field. In fact, what happened was that von Neumann was involved with the Los Alamos, the Manhattan Project to build the atom bomb. Now, during the mid-40s, he was assigned by Los Alamos to find more computing power. And so he was scouring the country, the US, looking for machines that could compute as fast as possible. And then quite by accident, despite von Neumann being incredibly plugged in to the US government by this stage, he was just standing on a platform in Maryland, I think. And another person on that platform recognized him, and he was a mathematician called Hermann Goldstein. Now, Goldstein was a mathematician, but he was also an army officer, and he was the army liaison for a computing project. It was the ENIAC, which was a massive room-filling electronic digital computer. And it was the first electronic computer that was built, and that was immensely important because these things were huge magnitudes, thousands of times faster than the electromechanical computers that were around. Now, Goldstein went up to von Neumann and started chatting with him, and it was merry conversation. And then he mentioned that he was involved with this project, and von Neumann's eyes just lit up immediately. And Goldstein said that the nature of the conversation changed from sort of polite and friendly discourse to the level of a sort of PhD examination. And so von Neumann gets involved in the ENIAC project. Now, the ENIAC was, like all other computers really at the time, built for just one purpose, right? And in the case of the ENIAC, it was calculating the trajectories of artillery, which was hugely important and required heavy sort of computational resources. And a lot of these computations were being done at Los Alamos by hand by women using punch card devices and slide rules and things like that. They were incredibly fast, but the hope was that the ENIAC would be a lot faster. Now, unfortunately, it would turn out that the ENIAC would only be ready after the Second World War. And von Neumann, when he engaged with them, I think it was towards the end of the Second World War, he immediately realized that the fact that the ENIAC could only be programmed to do one thing was a huge weakness. And he immediately understood its limitations and thought about how you would design a computer that could be programmed to do anything. And now you could, of course, get the ENIAC to do, something different, but you would have to unplug the various plugs and rewire the thing, which could take weeks. And then you had to troubleshoot and so on. That's not like the computers of today, right? You just download an app onto your phone and it works, hopefully. And so one of the first contributions that von Neumann was asked to make was to come up with the design of a future computer called the EDVAC. And so he wrote this report called the EDVAC report, and it set out the blueprint of a programmable computer. And this involved a computer having a massively larger memory than anything that had gone before, because that memory didn't just need to hold numbers, it didn't just need to hold the results of calculations, but it needed to hold programs. And then the central processing unit would take instructions line by line and run them. And there was an addition unit. This whole architecture came to be called the von Neumann architecture. Now, so that was how it started. And then Goldstein, without the permission of the ENIAC team, or indeed without von Neumann's permission, sent the EDVAC report to every single nascent computer project through the whole world. And it became the foundation stone of all future computers down to the present day. The second thing that happened is that von Neumann insisted that everything that he was involved with was in the public domain. And this caused huge ructions within the ENIAC team, because the ENIAC's two inventors, Mockley and Eckert, wanted to spin off their own company and wanted to patent stuff.
Yes.
This later led to a huge row. The team broke up, and von Neumann then went off to the Institute for Advanced Study to build his own computer. And whilst he was doing that, all of the progress reports that were issued were made public, and these turned out to be of huge influence. So his computer took quite a while to come to fruition. It took sort of many more years than he thought. But during this whole period, he was sending out these reports. So these would really be absolutely foundational to the dawn of the computer age. Once the IAS computer was complete, which was in 1953, I think, finally, von Neumann would also consult for IBM, and IBM was paying him a rather nice extra salary, but he helped them design their first commercial computer. And it's no coincidence that IBM's first commercial computer was practically a carbon copy of von Neumann's machine at the Institute for Advanced Study. And IBM, of course, would be, the biggest company of that, of the computer age to begin with over the next couple of decades. So, so in practical terms, you can see that von Neumann was heavily involved with setting out what future programmable computers should look like, such that every computer we use today, practically, including the smartphone in your pocket, runs on something called the von Neumann architecture, which he set out in the EDVAC report. He could be considered the godfather of kind of open source, because he was a champion of that right from day one. And then lastly, with Los Alamos breathing down his neck and saying, look, where are these, computer resources going to come from? He went back to the ENIAC, and together with his second wife, Klari Dan, they converted the ENIAC into a very primitive sort of stored program computer. And Clara would write the first program for it. Now, this wasn't just some sort of toy program. This would be a simulation of how neutrons inside an atom bomb would travel through the core and trigger the chain reaction. And we know that that simulation was entirely accurate, and it was used as the basis for the future design of atom bombs. Now, Clara was just incredible herself. So she was, I think at the age of 13, she was a Hungarian national ice skating champion, but she claimed to have no talent at all in mathematics.
Yeah, exactly. You write in your book, Clary describes herself as a mathematical moron in her memoirs, but her view of herself was colored by profound insecurity, no doubt exacerbated by a marriage to quite probably the smartest man on earth. That was really interesting to read after reading what you have just said.
Yeah, so she wasn't, of course, the only person to be incredibly intimidated by von Neumann's intellect. Von Neumann's best friend was a guy called Eugene Wigner, who he had known since childhood. Now, Wigner would go on to win a Nobel Prize in physics based on some of the work that he did with von Neumann, right? Von Neumann had passed away by this stage. Otherwise, potentially, von Neumann might have picked up a Nobel too. Yeah. But Wigner writes that von Neumann's intellect, was astonishing, and he had never come across anybody who could think faster than von Neumann. And he said, I met many people like Einstein and so on, and nobody ever disagreed with my assessment of von Neumann's intellect. But Clary was, we would say now that she suffered from depression, although that kind of diagnosis was simply not available at the time. Her father walked in front of a train within, I think, a year of arriving in America. They were from another wealthy Jewish Hungarian family. But it's quite clear that she was a very, very sharp woman. During the war, she made herself useful by joining a Princeton mathematical modeling group, and she was involved in looking at sort of population dynamics. Yeah. And Princeton then offered her a permanent position, a permanent academic position, which she turned down. So I don't think she could have been altogether as useless as she makes out. And she coded this program by hand, going right down to kind of binary instructions. And it was a 700-line code. Now, it's very important to set the scene here. There was no programming languages at all for her to use. And in fact, von Neumann spurned this idea that anybody would need such a thing as a programming language, because he said, why can't you just code it in binary? It's easy. And this was a useful program, but it was I think it was in the mid-40s, and her program ran before the Manchester Baby ran its first program. Now, the Manchester Baby is generally recognized as the first proper programmable computer. It was built at the University of Manchester. And it was based on von Neumann's EDVAC report, right? So it was a von Neumann architecture machine. And all it did 3 months later was to factorize a very large number, which, frankly, a primary school child, if they were pretty bright and given good direction, could do. What Clara did was simulate an atom bomb. So these are quite different achievements, and we now know, thanks to historical research, that Clara's programs ran a good 3 months, I think, before the Manchester baby. So in that light, von Neumann made another contribution, which was the first stored program computer to run a program was done under his direction, and his wife was responsible for the first modern computer program.
That's truly fascinating. There is one more field that I would like to spend a few minutes on, namely quantum theory, because at some point, of course, John von Neumann turned to this field as well. And as you write, in the 1920s, within the quantum theory, there emerged two approaches, the so-called matrix mechanics and mechanics based on waves. As you write, the question arose at some point, how could two such different theories be describing the same quantum reality? And that, of course, disturbed many outstanding physicists like Niels Bohr or Albert Einstein. How did John von Neumann approach this issue? Did he reconcile both theories?
Yeah, so let's start with how he came to be in Göttingen, right? Because von Neumann is finishing off his PhD, and who does he get as an external examiner? He gets David Hilbert, who is the premier mathematician, really, in the world at the time. He's kind of a big standard bearer for mathematics. And he runs the maths department at the University of Göttingen. Now, von Neumann's thesis defense, as you can imagine, goes really rather well. And apparently the only question that David Hilbert asks him is that, pray tell, who is the candidate's tailor? Because he is so impressed by von Neumann's suit. So von Neumann then does the natural thing, which is to go off to Göttingen, which is the center of the world, really, for mathematics in the early 20th century. And he goes off, he gets a scholarship from the Rockefeller and joins Hilbert in Göttingen, where, by complete coincidence, there is another young genius who's actually a year older than him, called Werner Heisenberg. Now, Heisenberg's been pretty busy trying to work out what's going on with a whole bunch of strange experiments in the world of the atom. And he starts to address this by looking at the spectra of atoms. And this is like, if you zap atoms with energy, with electricity or whatever, they emit certain frequencies of light. And he went about trying to explain why particular atoms emit some frequencies of light, but not others. Now, Heisenberg's approach was unusual. He didn't really care about what was going on inside the atom. All he was interested in was explaining the phenomena that you could see, because the argument is that we can't see inside an atom, so why speculate? Instead, he just went about explaining these lines, and he came up with what became the first formulation of what we now call quantum mechanics. And his was the matrix formulation, and essentially it was grids of numbers that you could multiply together, and hey presto, they could explain what atom would produce what light and at what frequency. Now, nobody much liked Heisenberg's formulation, unfortunately, because the mathematics was really odd. It was something that was very strange to physicists at the time. People really didn't know about matrices, even though they'd been invented a while ago. They weren't really used in physics. So just a few months later, another guy, Erwin Schrödinger, based in Vienna, came up with his own formulation, and this involved waves. It was called wave mechanics. Now, physicists are much more comfortable with waves. They've dealt with waves for a very long time, electromagnetic waves, water waves, and so on. And the mathematics was calculus and differential equations, which physicists use all the time. So suddenly, you know, von Neumann's arrived, and bang, bang, you've got these two completely different formulations of this new science of quantum mechanics, the science of the atom. And so von Neumann naturally gets drawn into this. And Hilbert sort of asked him to explain this stuff, because Hilbert doesn't really understand what's going on. Now, what the problem was that you had these two mathematical versions of quantum mechanics, but they looked completely different. But they both were equally good at explaining the various phenomena that had been cropping up. So people were trying to reconcile this. So what was it telling us about what was actually going on in the atom, and how could they be so different? How could these things look so different? So what von Neumann showed was that essentially the mathematics here were sort of two sides of the same coin. What you could do is break the waves down in Schrödinger's formulation into little components, that were quite uniform and that you could add together to make the complete wave. And how much you added together, you know, that was a number, a little magnitude of each wave, and those were the numbers that ended up being in Heisenberg's matrices. So he showed that there was this deep mathematical connection between the two. And this was a breakthrough. And then von Neumann ended up spending the next few years, not exclusively, but working out the mathematical foundations of quantum mechanics. And those mathematical foundations are pretty much the same today. And he called it a formulation in Hilbert space after his mentor, but that was kind of being polite. Hilbert had developed some of the tools, but it was really von Neumann that became the expert in those tools by the time he was done. And that was his usual way, which was to pick up something that somebody had invented and then just run with it, you know, several light years into the future. So yeah, that was how he came to reconcile those things. And so he proved this. And so what did this tell us about the physical world? Well, it told us that you can imagine it however you like, but ultimately all we know is that the mathematics really works, and that's pretty much where we are even now with quantum mechanics. So you can think about these electrons jumping from different levels within an atom, or you could think about waves, if you like, waves, the electrons are waves. You can think about however you like, but ultimately what we really know is that the maths of quantum mechanics works. And von Neumann really helped to formalize that mathematics.
And now I would like to ask you, what kind of person was John von Neumann, and what was his worldview?
Yes, this is a fascinating question, which is made difficult by the fact that he didn't keep a journal. So all we have really are what people said about him. One of his brothers wrote a little pamphlet about von Neumann, and of course his second wife kept this incredible journal. Klari Dan kept this incredible journal herself. There's a lot of myths about him, and there are various misunderstandings about him that are perpetuated even down to the present day. And you know, often if you search Wikipedia, you'll come across stories which are of dubious authenticity. Now, there are various things that we know about him. We know that he was, at least superficially, a bit of a party animal. We know that from his daughter's accounts. He could drink martinis, and he prided himself on being able to hold his alcohol. But we also know that in the middle of a party, he would quite often disappear upstairs to his study and write down some mathematical proof or other if he was inspired, and then he'd come back down and start conversing again. He would tell jokes and dirty limericks and things like that. He threw these enormous parties at his house, which is a lovely house actually in Princeton, which he bought with his second wife, Klari Dan. I went to visit it, and it's owned by another family. And that house has stayed within that family ever since Klari Dan sold it to move to California in the late 50s. And you could see how it might have worked as a party house. So we know that. We also know that later on, after the Second World War, von Neumann had these terrible experiences growing up of a communist regime that came in to Hungary. It didn't last very long, but it was very unpleasant at the time. There was then a counter-revolution, which was, if anything, even worse. And he, of course, had left Europe by 1930, but he had predicted that there would be a Second World War in quite a lot of detail. And he predicted that, Germany would be responsible. And we know this from his letters. And he saw what Germany was becoming under the Nazis. And whilst he hated communism, he probably hated the Nazis even more. That's what his wife said, especially as it became clearer and clearer what they were doing. So he became very cynical, I think, about human nature after that. He stopped believing that humans were essentially good because of what happened there. Of course, to him, Germany was the center of the intellectual world, as it was really prior to the Nazis arriving on the scene. And he could never really go back to Europe after what had happened. I think he had one post-World War II visit, but he found it really too traumatic, and he stayed in America for the rest of his life. So we know that he was a fairly committed Democrat. Now, in that light, after the Second World War, he did press for a nuclear strike against the Soviet Union before the Soviet Union could develop nuclear weapons itself. He really didn't trust Stalin, and in some ways he came to that distrust much earlier than many other scientists.
Many others, yes.
Yeah, some people were quite happy to talk about communism, but it was only after the Second World War that it became clear that what was going on in the Soviet Union was not at all pleasant, and Stalin was not to be trusted. Now, again, this seems shocking. How could you press for a strike on a country and which would obviously leave hundreds of thousands dead? The surprising thing is that even pacifists, perhaps like Bertrand Russell, also pressed for a nuclear strike. They said, the Soviet Union should be offered an ultimatum that give up all your ambitions of nuclear weapons, or face a strike. And so this was the context at the time, and there was a fairly large minority amongst the US public that also favored this approach. And luckily, the US government was sensible enough to hold off. But one thing is that von Neumann was very alert to the idea that the Soviet Union was pressing ahead with nuclear weapons, and he was proven right, because the Soviet Union was actually ahead on the development of intercontinental ballistic missiles, and they were almost a decade ahead at one stage of the US. So he realized that the Soviet Union had tested a fusion bomb that was going to be much, much smaller than any test that had come before. And so he knew that they were developing a bomb that could be mounted on a missile. And in fact, the technology that they would use to launch Sputnik, I think on the year of von Neumann's death, in fact, would be the same technology that they would use to then test their first intercontinental ballistic missile. They were then a year ahead of the US, which tested its first intercontinental ballistic missile just a year later. But it would have been much, much later had von Neumann not pushed the US government to develop ICBMs and say, hey, look, you know, the Soviet Union's way ahead on this game. Now, by the time it got to the late 40s and early 50s, von Neumann had realized that there would be no quick nuclear war, and he had changed his mind. Again, he was ahead of everybody else because the de facto policy of the United States became something called massive retaliation in the early 50s, very briefly, thankfully. The idea there was if the Soviet Union did anything which was involved some sort of, you know, incursion into, you know, another country, or they supported something, then the US would immediately retaliate with a massive nuclear strike. Luckily, this policy was never carried out, because if you look what was happening in Asia, you know, and so on, then they would have had to have launched by their own policy a massive nuclear strike on Russian soil. But von Neumann by this stage had changed his mind, because he knew that this would lead immediately to a massive exchange of nuclear weapons. So it's a complicated story even here. And it was simplified down to this idea that von Neumann was this extremely hawkish right-wing character, which he in fact wasn't. I think now if we met him today, his views would be recognized as basically a liberal standard.
Liberal, probably, yes.
Views. You know, maybe a bit neoliberal in terms of economics, but nothing really very out of the ordinary on that score. And in his day-to-day dealings, you know, we have accounts from many of his best friends' wives and so on that suggest he was, you know, a very charming individual. And we know, for example, against the grain of the time, that he was not racist. He, David Blackwell would become one of the most extraordinary mathematicians of his generation. He was an African-American. And von Neumann helped to nurture David Blackwell at a time when Princeton would not let David Blackwell lecture, right? And David Blackwell would then later acknowledge von Neumann as a mentor and say that he modeled his future mentoring along the line that von Neumann demonstrated to him. So given that von Neumann was consulting for private sector, for government, and he was working on, game theory, he was doing this and doing that, he still found time to work with mathematicians whenever he found whatever they were doing was interesting, regardless of their kind of, color or their sex. I think speaks volumes for the man, and much more so than, these secondhand accounts that we have suggesting that, he was some sort of crazy right-wing lunatic.
A fascinating man, a really fascinating story. It's been such a huge pleasure talking with you, Ananyo, and it was for me, it will be for everyone, a huge pleasure to read the book, The Man from the Future, The Visionary Life of John von Neumann. Thank you so much for meeting me today and for talking to me about a genius, mathematician, a physicist, scientist, who is not known well enough, for sure not in Poland. I hope this will change after this conversation. Thank you again very, very much for your fascinating stories.
Thank you so much. It was a huge pleasure. Very enjoyable. Thank you.
Thank you so much.